Okie doke. Hello, welcome everybody, for those who are live and also for Zoom participants, and later for those who are on YouTube. Tonight we have Brian Schroeder, who's going to do a presentation on men and women in the Bible. So I'll hand it over to you now, Brian. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah. Where we got? Right. Sorry about that small delay. Now, it must be admitted up front that many wrongs have been done in the name of Christianity, in the name of Christ, and in the name of the Bible. These wrongs do need to be faced up to. They do need to be addressed. And I think I missed it, right. And dealt with. And that includes in the context of the relationship between male and female, men and women. But except where it explicitly comes up in the course of this talk, that is not exactly the topic that I'm on tonight. So we'll see how that goes. Also, the Bible, along with Christianity, is regularly portrayed as anti-women, misogynistic, responsible for the suppression and oppression of women, a tool of the patriarchy to subjugate women. But on the other hand, Christianity is often derided as being, that's just for women. It's not really for men. Real men don't go to church. And churches worldwide seem to have a higher proportion of women than of men. So, what is going on? If the stereotype is true, why are women attracted to Christianity more than men are? What are we missing in all of this? Now, I've got a couple of books I want to read a few quotes from tonight. Both of them are written by women. The first one is this one, For the Love of God, How the Church is Better or Worse Than You Ever Imagined, by Natasha Moore. And in this there's a chapter on Christianity and women. And this one she quotes scholar and writer John Stackhouse. When it comes to the positive side of Christianity's relationship with women, first, I'd say that for all its faults, Christian civilization has generally been a safer and better place for women than any of the alternatives. If you look through the centuries, would you rather be in Christian civilization, or would you rather spin the globe and be somewhere else? Generally, you want to be in Christian civilization, however bad it is. And secondly, it has been only Christian civilization in the modern era that has taken, eventually for granted, the full equality of women. And that's just not anywhere else in the history of the world, so far as we know. When it comes to gender, our society is very confused at the moment. We are inconsistent and strongly maintain mutually contradictory things at the same time. Just a few examples. We're constantly hearing in the papers and the news about the gender pay gap or the gender superannuation gap and gender imbalance on company boards and company CEOs and all sorts of things like that. And there is a very strong emphasis on gender distinctions. But on the other side, we're told that gender is just a social construct, that you are who you feel you are. You are whatever you identify as. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't make any difference either way. Also, in our modern culture, diversity, which basically means we're all different, and equality, we are effectively all the same, are both of central importance. We insist on affirming people according to who they identify as and helping them to conform to what they believe. And misgendering is a grave social sin these days. But if a very thin person identifies as obese, we go the opposite way altogether, don't we? We don't encourage them and affirm them in their obesity and help them to shape their bodies how they want. We try to convince them otherwise and bring them back to reality. So we're all rather mixed up. And I'm sure you could think of more examples quite easily yourself of the confusion in our society. If we are equal, then all distinctions are nonsense. If we are different, then we should treat each other differently according to those differences. In the 1990s, a very popular book was Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. I personally haven't read that book, but it was definitely very popular at the time, and it really struck people where they were at. And basically the concept of that is that not only do men and women look a bit different, but they are wired differently. So that men look at women and think, you lot are strange. And women look at men and think, you lot are strange. Because there is that inbuilt difference. And that really struck a chord for a great many people. So that doesn't quite go with the equality and sameness thing. We're also told that masculinity is toxic. There is something intrinsically wrong with being male. Men need to be more like women if they're to be any good at all. On the other hand, women are told, you are worthless. You have got to do what men do and behave like men behave if you're going to be worth anything at all. And you can see the problem there. Whoever you are, according to what society tells us, there's something intrinsically wrong with you. You're just not good enough. The Bible, however, says, whoever you are of great worth. Despite the fact that men and women are supposedly equal, it is common knowledge that in virtually all cultures over the course of history, women have been considered as and treated as inferior, less than human, chattels, servants, property, and so on, to one degree or another. And Christianity has long been derided as oppressive to women, as the cause of most of the problems that women suffer, as something that must be eliminated if women are to find and gain their proper place in the world. Although why there should be a proper place for anyone at all is never explained. And yet it is in those cultures with a Christian heritage that things like women's suffrage, women's lib and so on have arisen. It's in those cultures with a Christian heritage that women are most valued, respected, and treated as having worth and value. And just consider the cry that is just normal into our way of thinking. Women and children first. You don't find that in other cultures. It's only these cultures with a Christian heritage that have that sort of concept. And it's only in our culture, with its Christian heritage, that we consider that domestic violence against women is inherently wrong. So Christianity has had that sort of effect on the world. All human perception is affected, coloured, and influenced by the culture of the time, the culture in which we live. While we can see other cultures, we are generally blind to our own and oblivious to its influence. And it's only when we are confronted by some other culture and we notice they do things differently to how we do things that we recognise that they have a culture. But for us, our culture is just the way things are done, the way things have always been done, the way things are supposed to be done. But other cultures have got different definitions of all of that. And we need to be aware that our understanding of this issue and our interpretations and judgments of the Bible are strongly directed by that culture in which we live, and to recognise that our cultural perceptions are not necessarily better than other cultural perceptions, and that other cultures, getting to know other cultures, can enlarge our understanding and our perspective on life. Our culture may be the best, or it may not. And even if it is the best, I think we'll all agree that there is plenty of room for improvement. Also, all of us are influenced by the culture we are surrounded by, for good and for evil, and Christians are no exception. Many beliefs and practices that are not right have been assumed true because everyone else does it and believes it. It's just how things are. Things are assumed and not questioned. Thus, Christians also have lived some of the practices around that have failed women. Michelle Lee Barnwell has written neither complementarian nor egalitarian. I've got a couple of quotes from here too. This whole book is on the subject of the relationship between men and women in Christianity. Finally, in social scientific discussion, the idea that equality could be a possibility for all of society arose in the beginning of the 18th century with its optimism regarding possible social transformation. The idea of the basic equality of membership in a society in the 18th century extended to include political rights beginning in the 19th and then social rights in the 20th. The concept that all people are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights comes from the Enlightenment and would have been thoroughly alien to the ancient world. The predominant belief instead was that people were, by nature, created unequal, as evidenced physically. Males as dominant and females as inferior. Socially, parents would be superior to children, freeborn superior to slaves. And ethnically, Greeks versus barbarians, obviously. Ancient society was not egalitarian in the modern Enlightenment, individualistic, political, philosophical sense, in which equality is a self-evident human right and or social goal for everyone. The Bible also was not written in a vacuum. It is centred on history and events and on people, and thus very much depends on the culture of the time in which it was written. A culture not just of Israel, but of the wider world in which they lived. And much of what we see in the Bible is not theological prescription so much, but simply a record of cultural norms, of which they thought about no more than we think about ours. And just for an interesting little exercise, consider movies. Think back to movies made in the 1940s and just compare how cultural mores have changed to the movies made in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, through to the 2020s. And there's very different ways, just the culture, we can see it changing as time goes by. And it's got to the point where I read somewhere last year that movies made in the 1970s, some movies, when re-released for cinema or for DVD recently, have either had bits cut out or special disclaimers put at the start to say that there are things that go on here that we don't approve of, that are just not acceptable today, but were fine in the 1970s. Each decade puts its own spin on morality. So we must be careful of judging the culture of another time on the basis of our culture right now. After all, what will people in 100 years' time think about our culture now? How will they judge us for things that we consider normal? Thus, what the Bible says is most of interest where it stands out as different to or contrary to the culture of the time, and not so much where it just reports the culture of the time. So far as men and women are concerned, virtually all known cultures from the dawn of history display men as in control and women as subservient, to varying degrees. Men are the leaders, fighters, hunters, builders, thieves, rapists, sailors, merchants, rulers, prophets, priests, labourers, farmers, miners, artisans, and so on. Women are wives, mothers, housekeepers, prostitutes, including temple prostitutes. Booty from war, so when there's a big war, the men are killed, the women are taken captive. I'll let you decide which one you'd prefer. And sometimes they have roles as priestess, prophetess, shepherdess, and so on. And also, now and throughout history, we can see that men and women have different bents or inclinations. Some things men are more into than women, and there are some that women are more interested in than men. Just consider a few examples. Hairdressing, cars, flowers, jewellery, apologetics, babies, trains. And I think you can all work out which one is which and come up with plenty more examples to go with it. Women are dependent on men, and men are responsible for women, particularly in marriage. It's the way things have been in culture. Central to the proper functioning of everything is authority. or at least everything that involves some sort of relationship. Whether that be business, military, government, sport, education, family. Authority provides the structure that holds it all together to make it work. And this goes all the way to the top, and I do mean the top. As Jesus made clear in the Gospels, God the Son and God the Holy Spirit are under the authority of God the Father. Now, authority is purely a positional thing. It says nothing of worth, value, skill, superiority, inferiority, better or worse. Although, as a general rule, you would prefer it if the better people were in charge rather than under the authority of someone who's not so good. But there are plenty of examples in all those areas I mentioned, except for the God bit, in the military, family, business, where you have someone in charge, someone in authority who is really not the best person for the job, and much better people under the authority of that leader. And one extreme example is found in John chapter 19, when Jesus is on trial before Pilate and says, so Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of sin, of greater sin." And right at the beginning of John's Gospel, the person who wrote that, he goes to great lengths to demonstrate that this Jesus is the eternal Son of God, the creator of all things. And this is the person that we now see here, acknowledging that a petty human governor has authority over him at that time and in that context. Jesus was clearly the better person, but Pilate was the one in authority. The responsibility of those under authority is to submit, to obey, to follow, and to serve. The responsibility of those in authority is to protect, provide, lead, and serve. And you can kind of imagine that if everybody behaved like that in the appropriate context, everything would work really well. The problem is that's not quite how things tend to go most of the time. In the male-female relationship, authority has been given to the male. And as I pointed out a minute ago, that doesn't mean the male is necessarily better. You can have marriage relationships where the wife is obviously the better person, but the husband is the one in authority. Where the man uses that authority properly, much good can result. Where he misuses it, much harm can come of it. In Genesis chapter 3, we have the story of the original temptation and sin of Adam and Eve. God had told Adam and Eve, right, you're in this garden, you can eat and enjoy anything you like, go for it. Just one thing. There's a tree in the middle of the garden, do not eat the fruit from that tree, or you will surely die. Along came the serpent and had a chat to Eve and convinced her, to take some of that fruit and eat it. And she did, and she liked it. So she took some and gave it to Adam, and he ate it. They both suddenly realised that they had done wrong at that particular point. And later in the day, when God turned up, they both hid. So God called out to Adam, "Adam, did you eat that fruit that I told you not to?" And Adam, being the man that he was, said, "She gave it to me." So God turned to Eve and said, "Well, what's all this about? What's going on here?" And Eve, being the woman that she was, pointed to the serpent and said, "He tricked me." And so neither of them were any better than the other. But God asked Adam first. God held Adam responsible for the eating of the fruit, for that sin. Then when we get to the New Testament, there are a number of occasions through the New Testament where Adam is explicitly blamed for the sin. And just one brief example, from 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes, "As in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive." So Adam was the one in authority. Adam was the one held responsible. And that's just the setup that flows right through that God has put into humanity, into his creation. Has that come the right one? I missed one. No, something's not happening here. Click, click, got it. When it comes to authority, no human authority is absolute. All is delegated. Each one in authority is also under authority and must submit to the one over him or her and be answerable for the use and misuse of that authority. And this applies to the family also, husband and wife, parents and children. Authority doesn't come from any personal worth, but is totally from the one who delegated it to him or to her in that context. And he or she is then accountable for the exercise of that. Accountable to the one above and ultimately to God. So in that passage before with Jesus before Pilate, Pilate had that authority delegated to him by the authorities above him, including all the way to Caesar. But Jesus also pointed out that ultimately that authority came from God. So coming then to the Bible, whether you believe that Genesis, and in particular Genesis chapters 1 to 11, are history or made-up story, the fact remains that what we see there forms the foundation for all else that follows in the Bible. In chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, to rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock and all the earth itself, and every creature that crawls upon it." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him as male and female. He created them. And God said to them, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every creature that crawls upon the earth." This was on day 6 of the creation week, as explained in Genesis chapter 1. Man was created in the image of God as male and female to rule creation. Man, male and female, the image of God. To be female was equally part of being in the image of God as to be male. Man, male and female were given authority over creation. When we get to chapter 2 of Genesis, we find that Adam was actually created first, and then Eve was created from Adam as a suitable helper or complement. In other words, God didn't create us to reproduce by division like single-celled creatures do, but as two complementary beings who must work together both to reproduce and to be and to accomplish all there is to be and accomplish in the ruling over this world. We are different, and each brings to the marriage what the other cannot. And right from the very start, in all societies since, we see the woman bears the children and nurtures them, the man tills the soil, raises and or hunts animals, leads the family and takes the lead both in conflict and in building and creating. Men and women, male and female, are not interchangeable or functionally equivalent. Otherwise, we would not be male and female. Neither the male nor the female embody all that there is to be human. It takes both together. Both the man and the woman individually are fully human, but humanity is man and woman together. And for those of you with a theological bent, does that remind you at all of the Trinity? Following on from Genesis and the creation story, I've pulled out just a very few small snippets from the Bible, just of examples of how all this works. And I'm starting with Luke. In the 6th month, God sent the angel Gabriel to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin pledged in marriage to a man named Joseph, who was of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. The angel appeared to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favoured. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. So the angel told her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favour with God." And so the angel's greeting to Mary made it clear to her, or clear to us as well, that God knew who she was and had a high opinion of her. Now, they probably would have assumed in those days that God didn't pay any attention to women. Maybe he'd paid attention to important men, but not to women. But here it's saying very clearly, Mary, as a woman, God knows you and has a high regard for you. Mary, as a woman, was significant in God's eyes. Jesus' disciples, as we all know, he had 12 disciples, and they were all men. And that tells us something about the design for the leadership of the church in that sense. But he actually had many more than just 12 disciples. We read later on in the Gospels of a time when Jesus sent out 70 or 72 of his disciples ahead of him into town he was coming to preach and prepare the way. In the upper room on the day of Pentecost, there were 120 of them. And we are later told that at a certain point between his resurrection and when he ascended into heaven, he appeared to more than 500 at one time. And many of them were women. Just from the Gospels, I can give you names of 5 of them: Joanna, Susanna, Salome, Mary, and possibly Mary. There were so many Marys, it's hard to keep track of them all. But Jesus' disciples included women, and to the best of my knowledge, there was no other teacher, rabbi, or whatever in ancient times who taught women. Jesus was the only one in that sense. That was talking about being different or contrary to the culture. There's one very strong example. And this is just my opinion. In the story after Jesus' resurrection of the 2 disciples walking on the road to Emmaus, we're given one name, and his name is Clopas. And obviously that is not the name of one of the 12, so it's obviously one of the others. I personally believe that the other one of the 2 was his wife. And they were both Jesus' disciples. Yep. On the day of Pentecost, Peter was preaching to the people, and he quoted these verses from the book of Joel in the Old Testament. "In the last days," God says, "I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my men servants and maidservants, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy." And you noticed I kind of coloured that a little bit to make it clear that it was both the men and the women that were included. And what's more, this is not just a New Testament thing, not just an Old Testament thing, but both. It stated very strongly both the Old and the New Testament, the way this is quoted, that both men and women are together in this particular point. First Corinthians, here's a different one. "Women are to be silent in the churches. They are not permitted to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they wish to inquire about something, they are to ask their own husbands at home, for it is dishonourable for a woman to speak in the church." At last, here we have a clear example of misogyny in the Bible. Clear example of the oppression and suppression of women. Or is it? I've heard 2 explanations for this one. The first one was based on the fact that this thing that we have here is 1 Corinthians in the Bible was not just a letter that Paul decided to write to the church of Corinth. They wrote to him first, and in part of their letter they had lots of questions and things went on, and a lot of this letter by Paul back is answering their questions. And the idea there is that at this particular point, this was their words, steeped in their Greek culture, that women are to be silent in the churches. And basically they were expressing like this to Paul so that Paul could say, yep, that's it, that's how it's got to go. But instead, Paul put them in their place. In verse 36, "Did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only ones it has reached? So in that interpretation, Paul is really telling them off. No, that is not right. And there are actually other clear examples, even just in 1 Corinthians, of women speaking in the church. So obviously that wasn't quite what Paul was getting at. And when I was a Bible college student, that was the interpretation that my lecturer at the time put on this. However, there's another interpretation which I'm now leaning towards myself. In many cultures, including their culture at that time, when you have a big public meeting, you have the women on one side and you have the men on the other. And just saying that in the abstract, I can kind of see that and believe it. But back about 15 or so years ago, I was in Pakistan and we had a big meeting there at night with over 1,000 people in the meetings. And I could look out and see on that side, almost totally women. On that side, almost totally men. And you can imagine if a woman over here wants to ask her husband a question over here, she has to shout across everybody and disrupt everything that's going on. And the verse just before the ones we read was verse 33. God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Don't call out across the church and disrupt everything. Wait till you get home, you can ask in private. And if men had been inclined to do the same thing would have applied to the men. And that makes an awful lot of sense to me. It's not against women per se, it's about disrupting everything. Now, I'm not going to read all of this. It's a bit of a longish passage. Again, this is another passage that we are reasonably well aware of and that gets brought up quite regularly when trying to say how the Bible is anti-women. Particularly based on verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body. If you read it through, the end purpose, the end result, the desire of all of this is unity and maturity, as in to unite together. This passage quotes that bit in Genesis chapter 2 when the man and the woman first met each other. And for this reason, the man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, and they will be one. But there's more to it than that. Yep. The body is different parts for different purposes, and so it's kind of making clear that the wife has one part, one role, the husband has a different part and a different role. But Paul's command to husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it was actually a total reversal of conventional wisdom and culture. This was a great big flag that stuck out that they all would have seen and recognised at that time as totally counter-cultural. In Lee Barnwell's book again, where is it? Page 157. Just got to pick out a bit here. The husband as the head is called to give himself up for the wife as his body, just as Christ gave himself up for the church, which is his body. Furthermore, where normal expectations would have the body being the one to love the head, Paul states that the husband as the head is to love his wife as his body, as Christ loved the church. The fundamental nature of the reversal is critical. It would have struck Paul's audience not only as odd, but even more so as being against nature. The sacrifice of the head would be suicidal for the entire body, since the head provides guidance for the whole. The reversal in expectations in regard to love would also seem shocking in light of traditional honour conventions, because Paul tells the most esteemed part, the head, to love the body. Maintaining the natural order was key to preserving society, and one accepted aspect of this order was the husband as ruler over the wife, due to his superior nature. It was vital that all parties conform to the hierarchy, especially since the household order was seen as a microcosm of society. Keeping the household order was indispensable to guaranteeing order in society as a whole. And since the man is intended by nature to rule as husband, father, and master, deviating from this hierarchy was harmful to the state as well as the household. And so when Paul asks husbands as heads to sacrifice themselves for their wives, he asks them to do something that goes against this fundamental order of society, which would be considered disruptive and dangerous. And she goes on, there's more along that line, that this isn't so much a seeking to oppress women in this passage by Paul, but the total opposite. And it was that total opposite that is how they would have viewed it at that time in their culture. Another passage that is actually often preached on in churches is from Galatians chapter 3. You are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Yeah. I don't recall ever actually hearing this spoken about in context. The context here is Christians and their inheritance in God, the eternal inheritance. And according to Jewish law, and every other culture as well round about, when a man dies, everything he has is divided up among his sons. The sons inherit. The daughters do not inherit. Slaves do not inherit. And foreigners definitely don't inherit. And so here Paul is saying that so far as our place in Christ is concerned, our inheritance from God, none of that means anything. None of our human distinctions have any meaning in that sense. That we're all inherit equally. We're all heirs of God in that sense. Of course, not that God is going to die, but our inheritance comes that way equally. Also, what is implied among other things is in eternity, the distinctions we have now will be no more. And the roles we have then will be relative to Jesus, not to each other in that sense. There are many instances of genuine wrongdoing and evil in the Old Testament particularly, including evils done to women. But just because an evil is reported doesn't mean that the one reporting it approves of it, let alone is promoting it. There are many cases of a thing simply being reported without any moral judgment being applied at all. And there are many others, however, where the reporting is followed by a moral judgment and condemnation. And the most well-known example is of David's adultery with Bathsheba and the subsequent killing of her husband to cover it up. And that's definitely dealt with by God and by the prophets. Now, despite modern perspectives, the law of Moses, when fully adhered to, provided the best, most enlightened environment of any culture in ancient times, and even many in modern times as well. Divorce laws gave women some rights and protections. Special rights and allowances were made for widows. Rape was a capital offence. And interestingly, a man's responsibility in the first year of his marriage was to bring joy to the wife he has married. And if men really did that, I'm sure it would make a big difference to a lot of marriages and to society as a whole. And in the early church, built on the New Testament, women flocked in, finding freedom, respect, and opportunity that was, for them, nowhere else. Reading from Natasha Moore again. Typically, most women, and including most Christian women, got married and raised a family. That was fine. And Christianity encouraged men to be faithful to their wives. In the Gentile world, wives were to be faithful to their husbands, but husbands could also have dalliances with prostitutes. If they owned slaves, they could also have sexual relations with their slaves. In the Christian family, the husband was to keep himself only for his wife. And that, I think, was probably good news for Christian wives. But there was also another path that Christian women could take, and that was a path of singleness, where they devoted themselves to prayer and to working in the church, There wasn't such a path, really, within paganism. And so this offered Christian women who were religious and who wanted a life of contemplation. Well, Christianity allowed that. Christians promoted education. And so Christian women would have been taught. They would have been taught the Bible. And we know of some Christian women, the wealthy women, who learned Hebrew, which was not a common language, and they were highly educated. Women had a chance to use their minds within the Christian framework. From a biblical perspective, the core unit of society is the family. In most cultures, it is the tribe or group. In modern Euro-based cultures, such as ours, it is a combination somehow of the individual with a smattering thrown in of the tribe or group. Think football allegiances or political sides, for example. But whatever the core group is, all else must serve and be subservient to that. Now, as a rule, in our culture, all must serve the individual. Me is the centre of everything, for each and every me that there is, regardless of sex. Society, family, tribe, all exist to fulfill me. But to understand the biblical perspective, we must understand the family-centric core. The family is the building block of society. The family is where we find ultimate earthly fulfillment. The family is where we live out and experience the image of God, as expressed in Genesis chapter 1. So if we consider man, made in the image of God as male and female, the man alone, the male, was incomplete. And so similarly also, the woman alone would be incomplete. In Genesis chapter 2, we find two come together as husband and wife, and they are one flesh, united as a new unit of society, a new family. And then the natural outworking of that was children, as we see in Genesis chapter 4. And then all through the Bible, we notice that families are completed by children. And again, all through the Bible, there is much more that just presents this family-centric focus. Thus, the roles of male and female exist for the good of the family, to make it work at its best, not for the sake of the individuals. And where this is lived best, we get the happiest and best adjusted people who contribute best to society as a whole. Where one or more puts self first or tribe first, the family suffers, and so does each individual in it. And note also that while man is made as male and female, the family is non-gendered. So just as a bit of an example from a scientific perspective, atoms, protons, neutrons, and electrons are all different. But all helium atoms, for example, are the same. They're equal. Now, some smart aleck is going to suggest isotopes, but, well, families have different numbers of children, and they're all still families. As a general rule, all arguments around the place of men and women in the church and in society stem from an individualistic core perspective. When it's all about me, that anything that doesn't serve me is an enemy that must be opposed. Those with a tribal perspective find liberation in Christianity, and particularly women. Eschatologically speaking, the Bible seems to indicate that distinctions and authority structures in the here and now will cease to exist and be totally replaced by something new, as we saw in Galatians 3 earlier. It also tells us that now is not where it's at. Eternity is. It has been said that life is not a dress rehearsal. I say to you, no, it isn't. Life is an audition. Eternity is the real thing. Again from Lee Barnwell, page 86. What Jesus promotes is inclusion, in that he made it possible for all people to become disciples and members of the new covenant community. Rather than an egalitarian community, the believers formed a surrogate family, where people were included, not by blood ties, but on the basis of faith. The bonds among the members were the ties of brotherly and sisterly love. As Eliot notes, seeing Jesus' intent as establishing a community of equals is not only incorrect, but can also obscure its true original model as one as a household or family. In our culture, rights are of paramount importance, and my rights in particular. And that very much affects how we view everything, including the place of men and women. So long as it is rights and privileges in focus, from any perspective, man's perspective, woman's perspective, the answers that result will always be the wrong answers. The correct perspective is one of responsibility, service, denying of self. And it says of Jesus in Philippians chapter 2, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the very form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. But he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross." This is the biblical perspective. The Bible has very little emphasis on rights, except in the context of laying down our rights for the sake of others. And just read the Sermon on the Mount for one example in there. The emphasis rather is on responsibilities. In the Old Testament in particular, it doesn't say very much about the rights of the poor, but it says an awful lot about the responsibilities of the rulers and society in general to care for the poor. So here, it's not about the rights of the women or the rights of the man, but on their respective responsibilities for the common good. Where there are different roles, there are different responsibilities, each to his or her own. And consider also husbands and wives, as Paul spoke about in Ephesians chapter 5. Any man or woman who uses this passage to point to the other and says, "This is what you've got to do," has missed the point completely. The end, the desired and intended outcome, is unity, oneness, one flesh, mutual upbuilding, strengthening, supporting, helping, protecting. It's not about me. It's about us. And was this one slide out, was I? Yeah. So this is where we open it up to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Brian. Before we actually go into the discussion, could you pause the recording and find the pause button? I think you need to go up a bit.
Hey, where is it?
See the pause share?
Stop share.
Stop share.
Right, so
And then there should be a pause there.
Stop recording.
Hi everybody, and thanks for joining in on the discussion. At this point, I'd like to involve the Zoom participants to make sure that they get their fair share of exposure. So for those of you who in Zoom land, has anybody got any comments or questions that they'd like to address to Brian?
No, I'm fine.
Right, okay. All right then, well I'll hand it over now to the people who are live participants. And would you actually like to address any questions or comments to Brian?
And speak into the microphone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. My question is, I remember reading that book you mentioned at the start about men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I found it quite a humorous and engaging book because it talked about the different ways men and women tackle lots of different topics. My question is, in that book there was a lot of humour, so how important is humour in the dynamic of how men and women interact?
I think humour is important in every dynamic to do with human relationships, that we are made to be, well, amusing for want of a better term, but humour is one of those things that God has just built into creation in all our interactions, and that should also include between men and women.
This is a very general question, but we're dealing with a very general concept that was presented, and that is authority and its relationship to maleness and femaleness, or male roles and female roles, and that's all very well. But it seems to me the problem is once you try to, or you start to make it specific, because it's not much use if it's not applied.
Yep.
And so you've got all these questions that come up about, well, what about authority in church governance, and what is right and what is wrong? And, can women have authority over other women, or do men only have authority over other women? And I mean, you can come up with all sorts of scenarios and extremes, none of which is very explicitly taught, or perhaps there's different views on that as well. But there's a general principle, but it's how do we apply it is my question.
I'm all right with Mike, thanks. That's what I still. How do we apply it? You can't answer that one in a short period of time, unfortunately. That is a big question on which great tomes have been written. There's been a lot of discussions backwards and forwards, and that was one of the things that book by Michelle Lee Barnwell tried to cover. She tried to take a step back and suggest that basically the problem isn't so much the questions we were asking as where we're coming from and how we do it, and that we need to get the big picture right, and if we get the big picture right, then we can get the details a lot better. But if we just focus in on all the little points without getting the appropriate background, we're just going to get problems as we have been getting. And one of the things that I have noticed in the past in a lot of debates in churches about the place of women in churches is you have women seeing that men have this power and authority and position, and they want it. And men are seeing women are trying to take my power and position and authority, and I don't want to let them. And so it's both of them coming at it from wrong perspective, and thus doing more harm than good for everybody, quite a lot. It's been stoking conflict rather than unity. Whereas the way it's designed to be is supposed to bring unity and family and brotherly and sisterly love, as she said in that book, in that point, towards the end. Now, the nitty-gritty, there's still plenty that can be ironed out and plenty that needs to be ironed out. But again, those are things that need to be addressed separately, get the right attitudes, and then you can come into them and you have a much better chance of addressing them properly and coming to appropriate conclusions.
I'm interested in a supposed authority of man in marriage, because in practice it doesn't seem to actually work that way. So Anne and I, as far as we can tell, operate more on a consensus basis. However, when we were married, and the order of service was given, I took Ephesians 5 seriously, and so we did actually include the word obey in the marriage words. So Anne actually promised to obey me. So she said, she did it once and said, Thank God that's over.
So that's what you were asking before about humour?
But that's just a joke. I'm still waiting. We tend to just, if we have an issue, we talk about it, and we kind of arrive at a united position most of the time. And so the man in telling the wife what to do just doesn't happen. And I expect most families are like that as well. But there are kind of
Most better functioning families anyway.
Sorry?
Most better functioning families anyway.
So, but there are signs of some natural things where one person is stronger than the other. And so, all right, I can't cook. So Anne rules the kitchen and does all the food and all this sort of thing. And I have other things where I'm a bit stronger off and naturally take the leadership in that. So for me, in practice, this business of man being in charge and that sort of thing doesn't actually work like that.
Well, if we can take Jesus' example again, because he is supposedly our ultimate example in everything, he said at one point to his disciples, "You call me Master and Lord, and rightly so. And if I, your Master and Lord, have washed your feet, then you need to follow that example and serve each other." And another time he said, the person who wants to be the greatest and leader has got to be the servant of everyone. And that is, again, the biblical perspective. The passage from Philippians that I quoted of Jesus, who being God, didn't hang on to that one, but emptied himself to even die for us. So again, the leader it is a lot easier to submit to somebody who is like that, who's going to die for you and serve you. And there is another verse just prior to those ones in Ephesians, which is often also quoted, submit to one another. And I'm not sure that specifically refers to husbands and wives, but it would apply to that situation as well. And there are ways that we submit to one another. Again, this is something that came out in the Christian worldview that did not exist in any other worldview of men regarding and caring for their wives, not just treating them as chattels or servants or whatever, but they are fellow heirs of Christ in the gospel.
The passage where it says submit to one another, that comes immediately prior to the bit where it goes in wives to the husbands.
Yes.
So you'd expect that the whole thing that flows after that, both wives and husbands, involves submission of some sort.
Yes. And again, as I tried to make clear, just because it says the husband is the one in authority does not necessarily mean that the husband is the better person. Just as Pilate was not better than Jesus. There are a lot of situations where the husband is. There are a lot of situations where the wife is. And I've been in work situations where I have had lesser people over me, and I submit to them because that is how the system works.
Not easy.
Yeah.
If you're an older person, you have to report to a younger person. It can be tricky. Both ways.
My question then is, would you, what if your boss was a woman?
In the work situation, that's the way our culture works. And that is the way to do it. And if she is the boss, then I submit to her in that context.
Okay.
And actually, where I work, the boss of our section of the company is a woman who is younger than me. But she is the boss, and I submit to her appropriately.
So therefore, my next question then is, today's society, the women, and this may be construed as they're selfish, we're all selfish, but the women have expectations of careers and things like that, as well as family, and their husbands are often at home, sometimes helping out, and more often, not sometimes, more often nowadays I've noticed in the younger family. So why shouldn't the woman expect to have leadership roles in the church?
That is one of the more complicated ones that needs to be explored properly. How that properly works out, I'm not totally sure.
Because in my opinion, it's keeping many young professionals out of the church, or churches that exclude women from preaching roles. It's a very serious question. But
Yeah, it's a serious question.
Obviously, follows on from what you just talked
that
about.
is a serious question. It is an important question. It is not one of those questions that I was preparing to address tonight because it is a bigger question in its own right. But if we get the attitudes right, then that question can be dealt with a lot more easily and appropriately.
Okay.
I know within reasonable faith I've tried to encourage women as much as possible. We had Perry Forrester involved for quite a while, and now we have Bronwyn on the committee, and I'd love it. I'd love it if she took on more talks, but she needs encouragement.
One of the things that I mentioned was in that bit where we have different bents, and one of the items I mentioned was apologetics. And in this group and in any other equivalent group that I'm aware of, there is a predominance of men, that women in general are not so interested in apologetics. And I know for myself, and I'm assuming for the other men in this group, we really appreciate the women who do come along and get involved. We really appreciate their input, and we would like more.
I think it's SBS recently had a series called The Matchmakers, where it looked at Jewish, Islamic and Christian matchmakers within their communities. And it was an insight into the whole dynamic of how you organise and prepare people for marriage. And my question is, we tend to make a big emphasis on individuals choosing the partner, and my question is, in some cultures it's the other way around. The older, more experienced ones are doing it, which was seen in that program. So I'd be interested in a comment on that. And just as an intro comment, I was fascinated by one of my daughters when I asked her, when she was looking for a partner in life to marry, she said she had on the list at least 20 criteria. And I thought, how many blokes would have a criteria of 20 requirements for marriage? Could you make a comment?
Well, our criteria for marriage, I think everyone has got some sort of criteria of the sort of person they're looking for. I doubt that there's anybody who gets their full list fulfilled. But again, there are certain criteria that are important. It really helps to have someone with the same basic belief system as you. Marrying a Muslim and a Christian, for example, creates extra problems and difficulties in the marriage that have to get worked around. And how they get worked around can create a lot of problems on the way. And there are lots of other aspects as well, like any sensible woman would not want to marry a criminal. Same with a sensible man would not want to marry a criminal woman. There are aspects that you look at along that line. But our culture, I think, is overly obsessed with feelings. And we like to find, well, I'm sure all of us do appreciate the fact that we were able to find someone that we wanted to marry and make the decision ourselves. But love in the Bible is not talked about in the sense of feelings, it's talked about as a command. So the greatest commandment, according to Jesus, is love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And the second greatest commandment is love your neighbour as yourself. It wasn't have good feelings, or if you feel good about this, then okay. And in this particular case in Ephesians, the husband is specifically commanded to love your wife. So you may not have ever met her before. You just put together, you are commanded to love her, whether you feel like it or not. If you do come at it with that approach, the feelings tend to follow. And I think that was also one of the things behind that instruction in Deuteronomy, where the husband was told to spend the first year of his marriage to bring joy to the wife who's married. It builds that relationship, it builds the feelings, even if there's no basis for them right at the beginning, because you do it and the feelings follow, rather than how our culture wants to do it. It's the other way around. And then when the feelings disappear, well, chuck the marriage. Don't feel like it anymore.
Very good, thank you.
Just to support that statement, I recently reread the marriage liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer, and it says, with my body I do the honour, etc. So your body's not your own, it belongs to your spouse. And it says, for richer or poorer, in sickness, in health, for better or worse, and you stay together until death us do part. So it says in sickness and health. So if your spouse becomes mentally ill or something, that's not cause to dump them. Or if there's sickness. And it says for better or worse. Situations may become difficult, but that's not a good reason for throwing in the towel. So that sort of level of commitment probably actually creates trust and love.
Actually, another thing from what you just mentioned there at the start there about your body is not your own, it belongs to the other. That is one particular point where Christianity and Christian culture differs from everything and everyone else. In all the others, the woman's body belongs to the man, but the man's body's, that's his problem, his business. But in the Bible and for Christianity, that is so, but also the man's body belongs to the woman, and it applies equally both ways.
Yeah, that's brought out quite explicitly in 1 Corinthians 7.
Yeah.
And you're not to deny your spouse or deprive.
And it went both ways equally.
Yes, he is symmetric.
I have one other comment, and it's a thesis of mine, having lived in Christian community over the years and observing other marriages, is I think sometimes there's a part of you looking for something a bit different to yourself in the other partner. So introverts marry extroverts, talkative, less talkative, all those sorts of descriptions.
Night owls and early birds.
So I'm wondering if that's part of how God designs it, that we're attracted to something that makes us a bit more rounded or complete.
Well, yes. Each of us as an individual is not, well, I married someone who was very different to me, and we bring very different things to our relationship. The relationship grows and we grow more alike over the years, but we've got a lot from each other, and the two of us together can do stuff that one of us alone never could.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Anything else that people would like to say or comment?
Just reflecting and just wondering what your thoughts are on the idea that the differences which we've just been talking about within a marriage, there's also that difference, if you like, between men and women in terms of character and personality and ability and physical strength, etc., and of course they're just overlapping bell curves. There's a lot of overlapping in between those curves, but I guess the thought that occurred to me is that those differences are there very functional, and within that whole spectrum you can get differences from different places where they overlap, even within the huge overlap zone. But to what extent are these differences, if we accept equality in all roles, for example, are we tending to kind of diminish the differences that God intended, so that we end up culturally suppressing differences and making males and females more alike?
I personally happen to think that bell curves are very significant in this whole concept. Not something that I mentioned, I'm not sure quite how well that goes, but you get, on the extremes, you get both sexes, but the main thing, they don't, like you said, they overlap, but they don't coincide. And by pushing them together, I think we are definitely losing stuff. Losing stuff on the ends, we're losing some stuff from men, we're losing some stuff from women by forcing them to try to be what they're not. It's leaving out some of what they are.
What, demanding equality of outcomes rather than equality of opportunity?
Well, it's like I was suggesting earlier on that men are told that they're useless, they've got to be more like women. Women are told that they're worthless, they've got to be more like men. So you try to push them together and you are creating something that is less than the sum of the whole rather than more. You're losing some of the good bits that are there, some of the strengths in respective positions.
I've got three girls, one boy. I encouraged them all to become engineers. And only the boy did.
I've got a daughter that's an engineer in effect, yeah. Yeah.
I've got one of each, and the daughter was the one who studied science through university.
Oh, yeah, they're all good at science.
Yep.
Maths, but, yeah. My encouragement didn't work on them.
I encouraged them both to seek after what it was that they particularly wanted to do.
Yeah.
And they both had very different bents. Both of them not what I would have expected. But that's what they wanted to do, so I supported them both all the way and whatever that was. So shall we stop the recording?
Yep. I like the IT guide.
Yeah. Except when I accidentally hit a button when I wasn't meant to.